time for PerfBytes. What the is PerfBytes? The fourth square meal of the day. Don't bookmark PerfBytes. Waffles, microwave ready. Blobbity blah, blobbity blah. Add nutritional value to your brain. It's time for PerfBytes with your hosts Mark Tomlinson and James Pulley. PerfBytes. Whatever.
Hey, it's time for PerfBytes. James Pulley. Yeah.
Mark Tomlinson.
Yes, it's time for PerfBytes once again. Happy summer. It's almost August. The summer is almost completely through. And yeah, once again, we're hosting an episode of PerfBytes on something hip and sexy and new, like DevOps. Or as Scott Moore likes to call it, DevOps.
Yeah, I think we can find examples of all sorts of bad practices from other acronyms that apply equally to DevOps.
Yes. Well, you know, Scott and Brian, the Northway guys, they also have the Fragile, which is there's DevOps and there's Agile is Fragile, which I think is very true when you implement Agile incorrectly or not fully. But we are going to be talking about performance in DevOps. Basically, if you're a modern shop, a startup shop, or you've done it well at Agile and you're adapting all of the automation for continuous release and automation, continuous deployment for DevOps, you're probably still scratching your head. I had a hard time getting performance put into Agile. How the heck am I going to get DevOps to embrace performance? Where the heck should I put DevOps in to that as well? James, any tip right off the top of your head?
Hire great performance engineers, not testers, engineers. And I think you'll see why after the news.
After the news. And speaking of the news, what the heck? It's in the middle of the summer. There can't be much going on in the news, James.
Well, you know, it's the middle of the summer and conference space is cheap in Las Vegas because it's hotter than asphalt on the road to hell.
That's very colorful. Yes. What is happening in Vegas? Everything's the news in Vegas?
Black Hat.
Oh, yeah.
The Black Hat Security Conference, July 27th through August 1st. It's ongoing right now. So if you have anything that's wireless in nature, when you go by the convention center, turn it off because those Black Hat conference attendees will be looking for things to attack. Yeah. I'd be really nervous if I was the owner of the Sands Convention Center.
They'll be hijacking you and your phone, definitely.
Yeah. Next up, I think we need to give some industry credit to SOSTA. They have staked out a position in the industry with different technology sets, and Gartner has recognized them, has put them in the leaders quadrant, the upper right-hand quadrant.
Yes.
The magic quadrant for integrated software quality suites. SOSTA.
It's magic.
And I know Brad and a lot of their management team has been posting this publicly over the last week. You know, they have a right to be proud about it. They have pushed some people out of that quadrant. They absolutely have.
Yes, definitely. And they set their sights on competing with HP, actually not even really competing with HP because SOSTA doesn't sell giant hardware SANs, and SOSTA is not a cloud. I mean, HP is very, very huge. But HP Software, the former Mercury that you and I, we've worked at these companies, SOSTA's really set their competitive goals on going after that space for performance and testing, and they've made a real mark for themselves out of nowhere from 2008. It was pretty awesome.
They started just out on the web services front. They've moved just into standard web. They now have functional testing solutions. They now have real user monitoring, all sorts of different solution sets. They're growing by leaps and bounds. Hey, we've got to give them 2 thumbs up.
Yep.
Next up, from a company you might not have heard about, Mark, it's a company called Soft Velocity. They have a product called Clarion. It's on the verge of version 9.0 going out the door. This product has been around for the better part of 2.5 decades.
Really?
It's a template-driven 4GL solution set. It started on DOS, moved to Windows. It's got a .NET variant. It distinguishes itself because it uses the compiler technology from the old Borland days. A lot of the old Borland compiler architects went over to Soft Velocity for their optimizing compilers, And you can actually have the Clarion 4GL integrated with C, C++, and Modula 2 all in the same app. Like you can switch languages back and forth. It's kind of cool.
Well, why? This is not, Java, .NET, Scala, Ajax, HTML5. I mean, all those hip, sexy new things, James. Why would somebody be interested in this Clarion stuff?
It's a very high efficiency solution set for building applications quickly that are data driven in nature. The same template driven model for building user interfaces based upon a data model can also be used to generate an entire PHP application that can run on the web.
There you go. So if you're doing a LAMP stack, you can just export the thing. Boom, there's your LAMP app. Have a nice day.
Exactly. Just a couple plugins for which database it's going to hook up to.
Sweet.
And you can move an application that runs natively on Windows straight into the web.
Yep.
And also they have a user conference coming up September 23rd to the 27th in Orlando. If you want more information, go to softvelocity.com.
If you haven't spent enough time in Orlando yet this summer, go there and learn something geeky like Clarion.
And go check out any performance work going on over at Disney World too. They have a big performance test team.
Go say hi to Rex.
You're likely to find them in downtown Disney drinking heavily after a testing event. So let's see. Next up, Engine X. We missed this back in April, but it's now at the 1.4 release level. Showed back up on the radar in the last couple of weeks because of a 1.4.2 patch release.
Yes.
If you're not familiar with Engine X came out of a flurry of development, I guess about a decade or a little bit over a decade ago, of web servers trying to attack what's called the C10K problem, or the problem of 10,000 concurrent connections. And the other big ones that came out of that were the Light HTTPD product, also known as Lighty,
yep,
GWAN, and Cherokee. And so these are designed as kind of super scalar servers. But what that also means is they're highly efficient on resources, that whole resource fingerprint that we talk about of disk, network, CPU, and memory.
Yep.
So if you have a standardized application and you just go to Apache as a default, try out a couple of these other ones. What's it going to cost you? No code changes. Just put Lighty under it, or GWAN, or Cherokee, or Nginx, and see if it makes a difference.
Yeah, look at. And I'm working with a current customer who's, working. They were a big WebLogic shop, right? And BEA, WebLogic, they just kept growing and building and fatter and fatter and fatter, and then all of a sudden they acquire Sun, and underneath the covers, oh, here's Glassfish. Again, every time we've kept piling on. Look at Red Hat Enterprise, right? RHEL 5. Just get bigger and bigger and fatter and heavier and slower and slower and slower. And then the customers still come back and say, oh, wait a minute, this is just too slow. I'm looking for something lighter weight. So that's where
we're Sun. We have some more hardware for you.
Yeah, well, they'll always throw you more hardware. But then the cloud changes all that, right? So running Red Hat in the cloud, or running Nginx in the cloud, right?
That's right, because then once it's in the cloud, you're paying for every CPU cycle, every memory cycle, every disk cycle, every network cycle.
Yeah, and it's also really, really fast to spin up these smaller kernels to get the work done. So if you have a very erratic load that's, again, automated deployment, ramping up, ramping down, launching those instances costs a lot less because they're a lot lighter weight.
Yeah, and we'll include links to these on the website. My two favorites out of the mix for different reasons are GWAN and Nginx. Nginx can also be used as a content distribution network style node, which is kind of cool. It can also be an email proxy server. Mm-hmm. And GWAN, because you can build your templates out of C, C++, assembler, PHP, and that all runs natively. Yeah. As opposed to having to go to an external engine to run these. So
no
really
interop
cool.
cost whatsoever, right?
Exactly.
Super fast. Very nice.
And then number 5, I was going around a bunch of vendors' websites today, and I went to Gridinet and saw that its name has changed to Flood.io.
Yes, Flood.io. Actually, we had an email from Tim recently who may become a sponsor of of PerfBytes, which would be really awesome. So I think we'll see some really interesting stuff taking the Grid init infrastructure to a whole new level with Flood.io. So we'll see. We'll have some more information on that coming up in future episodes here as we get together with Tim. So congratulations to that.
So Mark, let's get back to this thing called DevOps.
Yeah,
and I got a question for you.
Yes.
Where the hell is the QA?
When it comes to QA in DevOps, imagine just for a second, James, that you're working as a functional tester up in a development group, shifted way left in the process, right? You're a QA person, you know the business analyst, you're writing tests, you're kind of doing the standard QA function, and you're no longer sort of a standalone team with a line item on a budget that says QA. You may have a separate dotted line management structure just for HR purposes, but for the most part, operationally, you've been subsumed into development. QA is part of development. And actually, some shops like to think that developers are testers and that they are good testers. Now, there's a whole thing with sort of the, old school QA, the person that builds the code cannot test the code because they're inherently biased, right? So developers don't always make good testers because they can't take the hat completely off. They don't want to call their own baby ugly. So imagine for a second that QA has sort of disappeared a little bit in development as a structure. Now, your role is a tester, but your department is development.
So
that's
as a
one.
tester,
That's one.
I'm going to go to a
Agile.
development manager and say, the baby is ugly. Someone who writes my review.
Isn't that
and who is compensated to get the code out the door.
Right. But let's keep the comment in there. Your comment is very good. It's a criticism of the fact that I've seen a lot of companies where they have QA has its own reporting structure to maintain integrity of, if there is an escalation or from an HR perspective, those individuals have a different ladder. But really operationally, and the ops part of operations is what I'm getting at, James, to answer your question. If QA is kind of living inside dev, what happens to the tech ops people over here? In ops, over on the other hand, downstream, shifting right, going downstream, well, there's never been testers. Testers don't work in production unless you're doing performance testing in production, right? Or you don't do any QA at all, and then you use your customers as testers. And we all know how that goes, right? That's a beautiful idea. And it fails every time. So QA disappears a little bit into a role within development, and then DevOps comes along within just the last 3 or 4 years and starts gluing together. You know what? Now that we've really got Agile working well for functional testing and development, we've automated our builds, we automate the regression suite, we've got hundreds of tests, automation, awesome automation. We can do continuous integration. You know what? What about continuous deployment? And there's actually, Jez Humble wrote a great book called Continuous Deployment, and it really covers the automation of the full lifecycle so that dev and ops start to connect one another. And primarily, you can look at that as an automation win, right? If you can really get things singing, and you can not only push code out the door, but within a matter of minutes, you can roll that release back. So that's that automation. Now, again, James, there's no QA in there. QA is only shifted way left, and I didn't mention non-functional testing. That was only functional testing, right?
Correct. But if you recall, we did have a discussion at Spring Software Test Professionals Conference with Brad Johnson of SOSTA, who noted that their integration with Jenkins, which is a part of this entire continuous integration and deployment strategy.
Yep.
But where I've seen these large failures is, sure, they want to automate, but you have people who are poor testers, developers, who are building the automation to go right along with their code.
Yeah.
And we've all seen the problems with performance tests built by developers. They have no think time, no pacing, and notice what's missing in this model in addition to QA is business. The business needs. I have yet to see an agile environment where the true business needs from a functional performance and security context were all known.
And it's hard to find all of that skill for performance, security, and even though HP and in Mercury before that tried to tout the 3 pillars model of functional, performance, and security all under one roof, it's really hard to find the talent in one person to put on a sprint. So why?
And developers are not going to like it if the QA analysts are more expensive than the developers.
Yeah, exactly. And also, since devs to some extent, they know the code, they know what they wrote, they know how to use a profiler, and to some extent, they might know how to run a load test of some sort, but it's only really relevant for testing upstream. So if you're testing in a lab, in the development environment upstream, and you're part of continuous integration, like the Jenkins plugin for SOSTA, or the Jenkins, you can get the Jenkins plugins, Jenkins, Hudson, Bamboo, any of those plugins that run a regression suite for functional testing could also run a 30-minute small load test every night, right, for a nightly build.
Sure.
Yeah. And so the idea being that it's not that hard to mechanically automate a performance test. But if you don't connect it to the business objectives in some way, shape, or form, you're either going to test with, like you point out, unrealistic think times. Current concurrency is going to be way off. Your unrealistic data, you probably don't have real data in development at the volumes that you do in production. So there's one rationale, one way to make sense of performance in DevOps is that the closer you are shifting left, the more you need to bring performance in some way, shape, or form also left. But as you move the performance discipline to the left, performance needs to become smaller and fit into the cycles, the size, the volume of data. Concurrency may not be the full-blown production, but it might be 10% of the load. And really you're looking for relative performance change from one build to the next. So if we automate continuous integration, go ahead, James.
And Mark, this is why I said you need a really good performance engineer more than you really need a good performance tester in a DevOps or an agile environment, because you're really looking at processes to measure items related to performance on an objective basis. And Mark, as you noted, you're looking at build-to-build changes at the unit, at the component assembly. You might even be involved in the user stories to see if there is a performance defect that can be isolated at the that bad word requirements level for something that's not testable or not possible, such as 100% of all response time shall be 2.7 seconds or less.
But it's okay to say we need to establish an SLA. We just need to know whether it's going to be 2.5 or 2.7 or 3 seconds, depending on what we can support. So the first rule of thumb I'll say is that if you're working in a company that's starting to adopt DevOps, the same rules apply for trying to integrate performance into Agile. We did a whole episode on Agile performance, and a lot of people have a hard time getting non-functional testing performed correctly in an Agile lower environment, 10% environment, relative improvement. So all the Agile rules apply, and also all the automation sort of best practices apply for doing performance testing in development. But I will say this, think of it like a scale. If you've got dev in one hand and ops in the other, and of course, James, to your point, QA is everywhere always, because we're like the force. It binds us and holds us together. It's true.
I could try a really bad Yoda, but I won't even do it at this point.
No, don't. Okay. Yeah. So if you move performance testing, most companies don't have a central performance team. They go from central QA or central performance. You're going to kind of split the performance team up and do small performance tests. The more you shift performance to the left, you also need to be aware from a DevOps perspective that, hey, we're automating stuff all the way we're going to automate those things in ops as well. So you might actually complement a DevOps shop by having some, dare I say it, performance testing in production. And we've talked about that. There are some shops that can do that, that will allow testing in production, the customer data or fake data, all the techniques. And again, Dan Bartow had a great presentation on how to do this. He's given it so many times. He's blue in the face. Seth Elliott from Microsoft also has a great set of tools on this. So DevOps shops should have non-functional, not just on the ops side or just on the dev side. You have to balance performance across the lifecycle. That's not different than any message, James. I think we've said in our industry for performance for 20 years. You have to think about performance all the way across the whole lifecycle, the whole process.
Except in this case, now that the traditional role is removed
Yeah.
as performance test as a separate discipline, you are compelled, even more so than Agile, because in Agile environments, you still see a traditional QA or performance test team occasionally or separate security group. But in this case, with DevOps, where you are totally collapsing the model, you are compelled to have that engineering integrated throughout. Mm-hmm. Or you're going to wind up building something that doesn't perform and it gets to production. And the first time you're going to do this, you're probably not going to have a good rollback strategy.
Yeah.
And it's going to be really painful. The amount of revenue loss could be more than equal to what it's going to take to find your replacement.
So, James, when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about where performance actually fits in and what kind of techniques work in the dev side and or the ops side as you try to tie these things together. But we'll come back right after this word from our sponsor, Nuco.
Hosting for PerfBytes.com has been provided by Nuco, New Centers of Excellence in Performance Engineering, PowerTest Professional Services, The Script Farm, LoadRunner by the Hour, Videratech, Cloud Architect, and No Load Test. For more information, go to www.newcoe.com or call 703-856-8187.
Okay, we're back. You mentioned something right before the break, James, about the traditional role missing, and that, like, even with QA functional testing, we still call them testers. They're not called quality analysts for some reason, but they're testers, and they live in development. And so if you have a performance person that used to be part of maybe a COE and they ran the lab right in the middle, right? They probably reported to release management. I know a dozen companies right now that are still doing agile upstream, but they're doing an enterprise release every month. And it sort of becomes very traditional release and performance at that release management line. If DevOps automates the heck out of that, right? So automated deployment into the performance lab, automated execution, pull the results and report them back to whomever. The ops side, you said something really interesting, which is if you don't have your release management rollback strategy automated and working smoothly, you're probably not going to have that whole flow all the way through promoting, right? And so that's a good tip. Until you have your release management strategy fully automated, and let's say performance is a mission critical for your app, you're still going to want to have a lab in the middle and not sort of divide performance upstream in development, small tests, and maybe performance in production if that's how you can balance it.
And you're right, Mark. We do see a lot of that where you have almost continuous integration and build, but there is that hard line or that air gap before it's actually deployed to production.
Right. And when you deploy to production, there's a whole different set of accountabilities, maybe even legalities, contractual SLAs. There's all sorts of things can happen in the electronic information business in the global economy of our world, where, if you can get away with a lot of stuff pre-production, pre-release, and you can roll stuff and you can get information iteratively on every build every night. If you can get it every night, that'd be awesome. But you're not going to be able to deploy into that performance environment in the middle. And also, we can talk a little bit about environment management as well, right? What if the lab gets decimated, right? The QA team doesn't exist as a standalone line of business. It's no longer its own environment, and you lose your lab. Now you just have a dev environment and a production environment, dev and ops.
And of course, the dev environment is under constant evolution.
Constant change, and usually only a slice of the architecture, if that. It's a very small and maybe not the same data. They probably don't have prod data if it's PCI or PCI compliant data, right? They can't actually put sensitive privacy data in there. So there's a lot of limitations in the dev environment to know absolute real-world performance, which is why I think when people are trying to do performance with DevOps, it seems like such an abandonment of old traditional testing processes because they're making decisions to not test the real world upfront pre-release in a simulated environment that's been calibrated and try to mimic production simulation in an integrated fashion. They sort of abandon that because it's like, well, the app changes so fast. Who the heck's going to maintain 150 machines in a lab? No one, right? It's a rotating, you got to have a team of 2-3 people that do nothing but keep the systems running. Also, then, if you're not doing any integrated performance test in an automated way to bring, let's say you have 10 different development teams and they all have different components and different websites and app servers and different parts of the system, if everyone tests in silos, which you do maybe functionally, but performance is shared resources in an integrated end-to-end system architecturally. So if you're not testing integrated, right, not just from DevOps, if you're not automating a mutual deployment into a common environment and run a production simulation, then you're not going to learn about integrated resource usage and shared resource usage. So your performance numbers are all whack. Again, this is another reason with DevOps why people would say I have fully automated continuous integration, continuous release. Everything's running smoothly to get code out the door, which brings me to the next point in DevOps. You hear the importance of the word feedback. Now, James, back in the traditional using test director, I'm going to invoke an old term, test director. You logged a bug, there was a defect management process, right? They flow of report the bug. I mean, this still happens with a Jira ticket or in QC. You open a bug, it goes back to development, they look at it, they fix it, you retest it, it gets closed, right? Right?
No, they just cancel the defect.
Oh, it's not a bug, right? Nothing's a bug.
Yeah.
Here's what happens if you just really have dev and ops, and maybe you have performance upstream, big time upstream. Your defect management loop is no longer going to a separate load test environment, generating a bug and looping back to development. You're sort of getting, if you're just doing testing in production and there's no stopgap in the middle,
you're getting severity 1 critical outages in production.
Yeah.
Which means you are either rolling back to another set of severity 1 crit sets.
Yeah.
Or you're rolling forward to the next set.
Yeah. So
that should be caught in traditional QA.
Yeah. So pre-release, you could just call that feedback, meaning the build broke, my nightly performance test that runs 50 threads. Maybe it is an integrated performance test, or maybe it's siloed, just as separated. But you get some feedback pre-release. If it hits production and your continuous integration is connected and you start seeing that these things go into production, the performance, they have another thing you can consider in performance is that those thresholds, it has to be healthy on at least one server before it will auto deploy to all the servers in production. So that's a way to actually have a progressive incremental automated release, and not just a line in the sand and all of the servers are running all of the time. Now, the problem with this is that if you have legal obligations that says you can't sort of run a mixed release in production, again, the more bureaucracy or the more politics or legal constraint you have or regulation you have in production, the more it pushes you back to deploying into a lab environment, a pre-release lab that is really made for production simulation.
There's also this whole issue of feedback in production, not just for defects and getting them fixed, but how precisely are you measuring in production and using what tools? Are you measuring passively? Are you looking at logs? Are you measuring actively? Are you using some external agent to actually run a copy of the business process?
Yes.
Do you have specific SLAs assigned to those? Do you have an exception process for those SLAs? So if you don't have this measurement against some objective reference in production, you're immature. You really can't take advantage of DevOps, even if you can automate the entire process, because you don't have a way to objectively measure what you have once it gets there.
Yep. The thing with DevOps from an automation standpoint, if the test is not good, even an automated version of it is not going to be good. It's not going to give you the feedback soon enough. I think what you're mentioning from a release management standpoint is, I would call it blowback. meaning you try to do something and it just blows back from production. So you've got feedback and blowback, and feedback is good, blowback is bad. So if you have releases that just come bouncing off production and it's not going, and you're not looking at production, maybe they are just functional errors, you could have the functionally pass a test, put it in production, automated release, this is great, but all of a sudden you notice that the traffic is half the volume because people don't want to use it. Or you find that just revenue. Look at like Netflix. Netflix, if they deploy stuff into production and they notice that the revenue numbers go down a little bit on this release, they'll actually back the release out. And you think about Facebook. Facebook will do incremental releases because they can support multiple versions in production at the same time. So they'll do a small release into a test segment, and then if it goes well and scales well, they'll go a little bit more, and then pretty much cross the threshold and they'll deploy across the entire production. They'll push all those changes out, and there's multiple changes happening at the same time. So, James, automation, I guess the first thing we just shared was, even if you're going to automate, you got to be smart about what you can automate and automate a test that's worth something to the business. Don't just automate for automation's sake, right?
Oh, yeah, we have enough of that already in performance practices.
Yeah. Just here's a script that creates 100,000 connections.
We have a bad test, so we're going to automate it, and now we get an automated bad test.
Yeah. It actually, I think, makes it worse, because if it's automated, it seems like it's out of our minds how bad it is. We forget how bad it was. Oh, yeah, that test, it's really bad, but who cares? James, it's the bottom of the hour, so you know what time it is, right?
Hello, PerfBytes listeners. It's your old friend Satan here. It is with great esteem that I'm proud to introduce this week's edition of The News of the Damned.
Can you dig it?
So Mark, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Does he stop into your studio every 2 weeks just for that voiceover?
No, it was a one-time thing. I had to pay just a small fraction of my soul in order to get the voiceover.
Well, pick up a blues guitar. I think you can, get some of that soul back.
Yes.
So you're going to love this week's show, Mark.
Oh, I know. I'm just waiting for it.
Because we have news from Great Britain.
Really? The UK, once again.
But it's not associated with the music industry.
No. I wonder
we had a woman crash an entire industry.
An entire industry. Now, of course, she's a woman. She's probably the most famous woman in PerfBytes history. It's the Duchess of Cambridge, Princess Kate, right?
Exactly. It's our Woman of the Year last year. Yeah. She left a hospital. Of course, had a new child, future King of England.
Yes. All right. So anyway, she
gave
birth
a blue polka dotted dress that was made for her specifically by a fashion designer, not available for sale. But that did not stop her adoring fans from going to that designer's website and crashing it. And then when clones came out, going to the clone websites and crashing the clone websites in a mad rush to get the dress.
That's total insanity.
What I don't understand is why the Range Rover website did not crash, because you see, that's what they drove away from the hospital in. And I've yet to see a reference to the baby carryall, that they put the young prince in before they put him in the car.
Yes.
No mention of that website crashing. So I don't get it.
Kudos to the fashion industry for revving up an entire set of online craziness. Because that's where all of their fans know how to click a button and hit the website faster than you can imagine.
But if you're that designer, given what has happened in the past, wouldn't you have an emergency website ready to go?
That would be my guess. Obviously, they're not listening to PerfBytes, so they don't understand. They could just do a static page.
Yes.
Hey, yes, that would be fine. And shim that in the home page and just put a big blanket statement, with the thing, and then click here to continue to the real
and
site.
Stage all of your content out in Amazon, EC2.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Good on you, Princess Kate. once again.
I think you're in good standing for a Woman of the Year this year as
still
well.
Doing great.
We've yet to have someone crash an entire industry.
Yes,
I think you're the first.
PerfBytes Person of the Year. Crasher of the Year.
Yeah. Next up is Stephen Colbert.
Yes. The Colbert Nation.
Or as we like to call him in the Carolinas, little Stevie Colbert. He's from South Carolina.
Yes, he is.
So, Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press appeared on the Colbert Report and handed a sweatshirt to Stephen with the tag phrase "Detroit versus everybody."
Nice.
Which I guess is from a T-shirt store in the Detroit area.
Right.
Well, you can imagine what happened.
Boom goes the website.
Yeah, website go boom. Email, phone calls, website, all crushed.
Oh my gosh.
So, if you have a friend that's going to give a T-shirt to little Stevie Colbert, look at your website before that happens.
Yeah, and once again, clothing, fashion. These people understand if you are in that industry and you are advertising online and you're selling online, these are rampant crazy people, and they're going to go click that button and buy it before anyone else gets to it. And
clearly, the IT directors you're hiring know fashion, but they don't know how to scale things.
Yeah, maybe put someone in charge of the computers that isn't fashionable, that really cares more about the bits and bytes and bandwidth than they do about...
Get someone who is a bad dresser, and actually you want to put a pizza underneath the door and get a diskette back.
Yeah.
Okay,
right.
Next up, from New Zealand, the ground shakes and web servers go hide. On the 21st, an earthquake hit New Zealand, and the GeoNet's web servers crashed as people rushed to the site to find out more information about the size and location of the quakes.
Right.
Now, New Zealand has got a distinct issue in that they have a supervolcano on the north side of the nation.
Which is the Pacific Rim, right? The Ring of Fire all the way around the Pacific.
Exactly.
Right.
It's kind of like, this is a once every, 500,000 to 1 million year supervolcano, kind of like Yellowstone is in the United States. Eventually they're going to blow. It's just a question of when.
Yes.
So it's probably an item of intense curiosity. And of course, they want to make sure that the hobbits and Hobbiton are safe.
The Shire.
And the Shire.
Yeah.
Next up, the Rolling Stone website crashed.
Yay! Ticket sales and rock stars once again.
Well, it's a magazine.
Oh, sorry.
Not Rolling Stones, as in like Mick Jagger.
I know they're on tour.
They are, but this would happen to be the magazine website.
Okay, fine.
crashed.
Yeah, sorry.
And the reason why is they put a picture on the cover of one of the suspect Boston Marathon bombers.
Yep, very controversial cover. I understand.
Apparently the story has a lot of like schoolgirl fawning in the article and stuff like that. So in response to this, an official police photographer who was with the police when this person was captured decided to release a bunch of his photos, which apparently caused, in your words, Mark, blowback.
Yes.
Blowback, as people had intense curiosity and wanted to compare his photographs to the Rolling Stones photographs, and the Rolling Stones website went down under the load.
Yes.
Although, curiously, there was no mention of the police officer's website going down. So he has a better IT director than Rolling Stones do, or the Rolling Stone magazine has.
Or it's just less interesting. Not a good idea.
Next up, this is from our neighbors to the north.
Yes.
Yeah. Prince Edward Island named best beach in Canada.
Yes, we saw this before, I think.
And we really can't complain about this website going down, because it's like a personal website of a gentleman named Wallace Rose.
Yeah.
He was putting out a website of his favorite beach from his youth.
Yes.
On Prince Edward Island. And of course, we had an event for Vacation Canada puts this website link, I guess, or this beach on its top beach destination. And of course, everybody goes to this website and takes it out.
Yeah, I wonder if there's someone in the marketing department who just said, I'm going to go Google a bunch of sites and build this little thing and do a story and put some links in the story. Ha, 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 this is cool. But they don't have a relationship with anyone they're linking to, any external thing. And they just assume, oh, it's a website, it'll scale. Oh, it's a website, it'll be fine, it'll be great. Oh, you just link it. I'm linking to you, you're linking to me, we're linking. And then it crashes. So I shame on you, Canadian travel site, who didn't understand that you can't just link to anyone that you find on the web, right?
That's probably the social media manager.
Yeah, social media manager.
For that.
How come I can't just do it? Tell me. Yeah. Gee.
Next up, Mark, this one comes from you. Dateline, New Jersey, July 20th.
Yes.
Snooki and the situation are not involved. As if going to the DMV was not annoying enough, the New Jersey Motor Vehicle Commission's computer system was offline the entire day, infuriating customers who decided to wait out at the Motor Vehicle Commission's offices across New Jersey.
Yeah.
Because probably they took the day off anyway, so they might as well sit it out. Well, What happened is the fire alarm was activated at one of the state's data centers, causing the Motor Vehicle Commission's website, their core website, to shut down automatically.
Right. Probably running all out of one data center, not in the cloud, just probably running out of a handful of machines and pew, gone. See ya.
Yeah. So offline impacts all Motor Vehicle Commission's offices, probably impacted the ability to get
can't log on
driver's
the website.
licenses, registrations, all sorts of things. It says fire alarm was activated at one of the state's data centers, which means that there are multiple data centers.
Oh, so just start setting up your replication. Yeah.
Exactly. So they had a single point of failure in their design, but going back to DevOps, performance engineer design.
Exactly.
Yeah, haven't they heard of replication to multiple sites where one is a primary and failover to a second site in the event of a failover? This is common practice where you have a single point of failure and a mission-critical transactional system that has to be up. I'm not going to make excuses for anyone in the government of New Jersey because this is simply flat-out bad design.
Yeah. All right, News of the Dam. That was excellent, and congratulations again to the Duchess of Cranebridge. Oh, wow. Thank you, James. Thanks for the News of the Dam once again. People still aren't watching the show, aren't listening, aren't learning, and yeah. James, you bring up an interesting point about risk when you're adopting DevOps and, most importantly, automating things for the sake of automation without knowing why you're automating things. So maybe talk a little bit about what you see those risks as being.
Unless the entire automation team handles a couple of things appropriately, you're going to have a distorted view of risk with your push automatically to production. One, don't assume happy path. Assume that your script is going to fail. Have a rollback mechanism in place to exit gracefully so you're not going to break everything else downstream. And this is a common failure in automation, both in automated functional and performance today. So all of this automation needs to have an assumption of failure. And Mark, getting back to the point of monitoring at every stage and finding an objective reference, you need to report against some sort of standard for success for those objective references, not just did the build succeed, but did the build succeed and did it pass security check or did it pass a performance check against a particular object or something, and then report that back to the business in business language.
Yeah, that's a key thing, right? Sometimes we tend to automate something and we give a return code, 0 or 1, or we set a little flag. Even a simplified, you see people that do red, yellow, green. And I like it when it's red because things are bad. I like it when it's green because things are good. But 90% of the time it ends up yellow because you haven't given a single assessment as to whether something passes or fails. So it fails for a specific reason, not an array of 400 return codes that could mean 16 different things to an engineering staff. It's pass or fail on the whole release or not.
Semantic logging is a good thing. Nice, friendly log messages as a part of your build process. Object 42 failed. not good. Object 42 did not compile successfully and could not be included in the build.
Yeah.
Much better.
Yeah. So, James, let's spend a minute talking about the DevOps culture. And I mean, these people identify themselves as a cultural movement. They have their own conferences. They've segmented themselves. There seems to be, you and I've worked at a couple companies that would call themselves DevOps culture. What do you think of that?
Do they have a flag?
Well, they should have a flag, right? They have T-shirts of different kinds. I would say, as opposed to performance engineers and classic IT who are into single malt scotch, these guys are into like microbrews. So they're into like unique boutique microbrews and facial hair. I've always noticed there's like this crazy outgrowth of facial hair, like beard growing contests.
Do they have berets and have an affinity for like automated assault rifles?
There could be some preppers, be some preppers in there,
like revolutionaries type thing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But I will say that all of it's sort of I want to say it's an underground movement. You could sort of call them, a cultural movement, but it's kind of anti-IT, right? It's well, that's the way the guy taught me to do it 10 years ago, so that's the way we do it when we do a backup of a system. And it's sort of seeing IT as being this old school kind of thing. And these new kids are like, I'm just going to, doing a backup, that's not what I do. I can do some development, I can do some ops, I can do some development, I can do some ops, I can do some development. Notice I'm not mentioning the word test, right, James?
Yeah, I do notice that.
You do notice that, right? This is the issue, right? I mean, computers are fun to play with, but if you're in dev, part of research and development is sort of like play, right? It's innovation, it's creativity, try new stuff. That's the place you do that, research and development. In dev, you can play. That's nice. And in ops, really, that's when you get down to business. And not to abuse the business term, but seriously, ops, that's where the rubber hits the road, and things better frickin' work. So in DevOps, they have this idea.
Or excuse me, Mark, that's where the adults work.
Well, it's ageism, what you've just done there. Even the DevOps movement itself is maturing, because if you read a lot of what they do, a lot of the things that, remember the Orcus and Narwhal, right? So Narwhal and Orcus back in the presidential election 2 years ago, or last year, there was this whole thing around game day exercises, and it sort of the definition of game day, a game day exercise, is everyone does the same things that you do on the first day of the release, and you simulate all of the disaster potential scenarios that could happen on game day. Now, that could be something like a spike of traffic. It could be something like a gradually increasing load of traffic that's sustained for a long period of time. It could be different kinds of traffic hitting the site in different patterns. It could be all of the different traffic to all the different components of the site happening all at the same time, while another guy runs a query in the background. All of these game day scenarios, 15 years ago, James, we just called that load testing.
Yes, and by the way, for both main political parties, you should be doing that right now, a year out from the next elections.
Yeah. Get your game day scenarios on. So this is the thing I mean by the cultural movement. It's like these kids don't want to call this stuff the same stuff. Really good load testers who knew how to design a production simulation and come up with disaster recovery scenarios, failover scenarios, DDoS scenarios. We can simulate. I've known how to do that for 15 years, but these guys are segmenting themselves and saying, well, you just look old and you don't have cool facial hair and a piercing. And I do have tattoos, by the way, James, so I could be in with these guys. The problem is you guys, DevOps folks, have a lot to learn from the old way of doing things, but even we, as old guys, need to freshen up what we do. There are some new techniques in the tool.
What you're saying is that if I was to attend a DevOps conference, I need to have like a screaming chicken tattoo over my head in order to fit in.
Yeah. The real fear here is that there's really good practices and experience that we already know how to do, and there's just a whole generation of folks that sort of call themselves, they're more concerned with being part of the DevOps culture than actually doing great automation and doing great testing. I guess my whole point is part of the DevOps culture is it's fine to want to be a little rebellious, right? And fighting against people in development who don't understand the real world and don't understand performance. Game day scenarios, our production simulation, that a really well-designed load test or disaster recovery under load or functionality under load, spike test, whatever, those make really good game day scenarios. You might need to get your old school perf guy out of the lab and figure out how to break out of the box and do some interesting things with different tools and virtualization. There may be new stuff, but the basic concept of the requirement is going to be the same, no matter what facial hair or microbrew you're drinking.
Fair enough.
Fair enough. Exactly. So don't be fooled by the superficial parts of DevOps from a cultural standpoint, because underneath the covers, they're being judged by corporations and companies and organizations to be just as sharp and valuable to the business as we have tried to be the whole time. I think if DevOps culturally, they're competing against bad IT, because really good IT shops, they've got all this stuff already figured out. They didn't need to call it Agile or DevOps or whatever. They have a really good process and it works.
Hopefully this is not a resume buzzword movement.
Oh, it totally is. Are you kidding me? It's totally a resume building buzzword. Oh, yeah, I needed it. Yeah, let's put this out there. DevOps is not a title. It's incorrect to call yourself a DevOps engineer because you wouldn't call yourself a waterfall engineer. You wouldn't call yourself a V-model engineer, right? DevOps is just describing a paradigm or a way of doing something. It's more like a method or an approach. It's not a title. It's not like a system administrator. System administrators know how to implement things that are aligned with how DevOps suggests you do stuff. Don't just code your little thing in your little bucket and then you push this button manually because you manually are part of a manual process. DevOps system engineer would say, well, how can I automate this with a web service call that connects to this other thing that's connected to this other thing that when these guys do three things, it checks for A, B, and C. If A, B, and C are true, execute my script, get it done. I don't even need to be here. All right, so once again, if we summarize a bit about how to put performance into DevOps, and James, you and I go back and forth on this, I'll say one of the first moves is to, just as you move performance shift left into Agile upstream, you need to think about balancing the equation by measuring performance downstream in ops. So you have performance measurements upstream and downstream, and then connect them in the middle with your continuous release. What's your tip, James?
I think those measurements that you have on performance, they need to be tied to an objective measure, something in a log, something coming from a view from the end user, something that you're going to measure time after time after time to assess any changes in performance. And what is reported back needs to be in the language of business, because ultimately you're trying to mitigate business risk.
Yeah, so if you're measuring something like AppDex, even though that's a really funky equation that you can get out of New Relic or CompuWare, like Dynatrace and stuff, you can get an AppDex indicator. Keep in mind that AppDex is an end-user frustration or end-user abandonment. I mean, the business should communicate about not just the number, 0.34 AppDex. Translate that into, we have highly frustrated users, very frustrated users, or users that are so frustrated they're never going to come back. And so communicate that risk, I think, is another good thing. I'll give another tip. James, you mentioned about automation. Keep in mind that all of this dedication to automating the process for DevOps, for developing something, building something, deploying it, testing it, getting all of that to production, monitoring it, keep in mind that you're going to automate. For good automation, you're going to have checkpoints and tests along the way that are pretty singular and well documented, or they have good messages in it. So make sure you automate well something that flows to promote things into production. But you should also think about automating what happens during that blowback, the feedback loop. So if you get information from production, how does that automatically flow? Like, what's the average response time in production? Am I plugging that into development as the test criteria? If our load in production is increasing 10% every month, should I also increase the load in my test lab back in development, automatically calibrate my load testing in dev to match the production simulation in ops. I think that's think of not only the promotional flow, but the flow of information all the way back to development also has to be automated.
And until you have these feedback mechanisms in place and the measurements are accepted by both the business and the technical sides of the house, you're not really mature enough to take advantage of continuous build, integration, and deployment because you don't have appropriate education mechanisms available at every stage.
Yeah. There's nothing just like that Aptex number. I mean, if I came to you and said, "Oh, hey, we're at 73% CPU," well, how would you feel about that, James?
I like my CPU at least 85% because it produces a nice warm breeze for me.
A warm breeze. No, the point is, a number is just a number. It doesn't have meaning until you communicate it and, like you say, James, educate. Educate the people who receive that number, whether they should flip out and lose their lunch because, oh my God, 73% CPU, or, hey, 73% is fine because we already talked about 80. Anything over 80 is a problem. 73 is fine. No worries. But if you educate a culture of performance that comes along with DevOps, that feedback loop, that's where the magic happens, right? For people to learn what you automated and what came out of it. Not just that the automation ran great, thumbs up, but actually the automation ran great, and here's what we're learning from all that automation. How long did it take to build it? How long did it take to deploy it? What were the errors? Were there any test failures? What's the ratios? All those metrics that are automated, yeah, you can put all those in there. And you should, to be really good with DevOps automation. And then, of course, the last tip I will say, James, is grow some facial hair and get a tattoo, and then know your top 3 favorite microbrews right off the top. And you cannot go wrong with Guinness. Guinness, you can always have Guinness. Guinness always goes over well with the DevOps folks. That's DevOps. That's an episode of PerfBytes right there, my brother. And thank you for listening to James and I talk about crazy performance stuff. I would like to thank, as usual, the sexy Irish voice of PerfBytes for her continual support and encouragement, and the fact that she leaves me alone here in the studio to just yammer on for hours with my buddy James on PerfBytes.
And Mom, thank you for listening. And just to let everyone know, this episode of PerfBytes has been powered by a Sinclair ZX Spectrum computer.
Oh, that's fantastic. You can subscribe to PerfBytes newsletter on the PerfBytes website. You can follow PerfBytes on Twitter. You can send us an email at ask@perfbytes.com. You can join us and follow us on the Facebook fan page. There's basically 16, 17 different ways that you can follow PerfBytes. You can subscribe to the podcast on Spreaker, Spreaker.com/user/PerfBytes. You can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. I mean, there's like a veritable cornucopia of ways for folks
Mark,
to follow PerfBytes.
You left out YouTube.
You can. That's right. Also on YouTube, and we have some stuff on SoundCloud. And we would love your feedback. So please send us your comments on any of those mediums. Send us something on the Facebook page.
And next show we will have some special guests. I will be in Nashville, Tennessee for our next recording session of PerfBytes.
Yes, James is on the road.
And I expect that we'll likely have Mr. Moore, and I would expect a vendor to show up.
James is on the road trip. You can get more information. Maybe he'll be posting stuff on the blog at www.perfbytes.com. So join us in 2 weeks for the next episode of PerfBytes. Thanks again.
Have a great week, everyone.
Bye. It was a little rambling, but then DevOps is just sort of a rambling thing anyway.
Well, perhaps we should have had some microbrews and it would have flowed better.
Yeah, instead
So I'll remember that. Before I go to a DevOps conference, I'll get like a big fake tattoo of a Firebird screaming chicken and put it over my head and grow a little goatee and get some really intense wireframe glasses. Say, I'm here for the DevOps conference.